Good evening, everybody, wherever you are in your exciting places. My name's Nisha McSweeney, and I'm here to welcome you to the October Anatolian Studies virtual seminar. We're very lucky today. We have the next of our papers from the 2020 volume of the journal. And we've got Rick Vaessen and Elif Koparal to speak to us today. They're going to talk for about 40 minutes or so, which should leave us a good half an hour for chat and discussion. If you would like to ask questions at any stage of our speakers, please do type them in the Q&A box. You will find this in the bottom ribbon at the bottom of your Zoom screen, the Zoom room. It would be good if you typed questions in there and you left the chat box for more informal chat amongst ourselves, so we can talk and quite informally discuss things beyond the paper in the chat. I encourage you to do so. It's lovely to see. But specific questions addressed to the speakers, please put them in the Q&A because it's much easier for us to find them later. We will address all the questions at the end of the talk, although please feel free to carry on typing your questions even during the talk as they occur to you. Right, so without further ado then, I'm going to welcome, first of all, Rick Vaessen, who is a senior archaeologist and a project manager at RAAP Consultancy, Archaeological Consultancy in the Netherlands, but perhaps even more importantly than that for this talk, he is also a core team member of the Klazomenai excavations directed by Professor Yashar Ersoy from 2014 onwards. We're also very lucky to have Elif Koparal with us, who is an associate professor of classical archaeology at Mimar Sinan University. And without further ado, I shall leave it to Elif now to share your screen, and let's hope this works. It didn't always work in the trials of this, just to let you know.
I know. Okay. Yes, here we go.
Whenever you're ready, Elif, all yours.
Is it working?
Yes, looks good to me.
Okay. Yes, okay, good night, everybody. Good night from Istanbul because it's already 7 o'clock here. Now, today we will talk about the early Iron Age of Klazomenai and its territory. And we decided to share the presentation with Rick, and I will give you some information about the survey first, and then he will talk about the excavations, and then we will have some conclusions. Probably if you followed the publications, the recent excavations at Klazomenai yielded to significant new evidence about the early Iron Age at the site. And one of the new insights provided is the gradual expansion of the site between the late 12th and 10th centuries BC, before it was reorganized first during the 10th century, and then it took the urban form in the first half of the 7th century BC. Klazomenai, however, was not an isolated dot on a map, but it was enmeshed in a wide area of maritime as well as overland route networks that link together big and small settlements. And in this presentation, we will touch upon the maritime connections, but our main concern is to take a closer look at the often neglected overland route networks and how they fit in the overall picture. And intriguingly, in contrast to the excavations, the surveys carried out in the countryside recorded very few number of sites that can be dated to early Iron Age. So here we will discuss if this does necessarily mean that Klazomenai was essentially an isolated shining light in an otherwise desolate landscape, or do looks deceive? And if the picture is more complex than it may appear at first, then where are the sites? How do we recognize them? And most importantly, how does this influence our understanding of the late Bronze Age, early Iron Age transition and the emergence of the polis at the beginning of the Archaic period at Klazomenai and more generally in Ionia? Okay. Ionia is often regarded as peripheral to the ancient Greek landscape and also accepted as part of a homogeneous system in the Aegean. And recent research sheds lights on the authentic features and dynamics of the Ionian polis and early Ionia. So in this sense, Klazomenai stands at a crucial point where we have substantial data from both urban and the rural about the early Iron Age. We have evidence from the Astu and the Chora. Archaeological practice in Ionia has long been focused on the excavation of post-classical urban sites and monuments, and historical narratives of ancient Ionia have traditionally been based on a combination of literary traditions and those large-scale excavations of major urban centers. There are only few sites where we have evidence from early Iron Age. Here you can see them in red frame. And our knowledge about early Ionia is still very fragmentary. In this sense, Klazomenai provides us with unique and very important data to discuss these issues. Excavations conducted at the urban areas since 1980s revealed the remains of a settlement that has developed from prehistoric mound and reached up to 30 hectares in the Archaic period. Excavations at the sectors, together with the test trenches opened within a 30 square kilometers area, also gives us a good grip of the ancient settlement pattern and how it was developed from early Bronze Age into the Classical period. Klazomenai is also one of the few sites in Ionia where its territory is investigated systematically. Although the field surveys have formed an integral part of archaeological research on the Greek mainland since 1970s, in Ionia, only extensive surveys have been conducted until the 2000s. So in this sense, Klazomenai survey project is a pioneer project together with Lohmann's surveys around Miletos. And in 2006, the survey project was initiated with the intention to provide a diachronic record of past landscapes of the Urla-Çeşme Peninsula, and 15 years of work to date have provided important insights, new insights into the deep history of Ionian landscapes. Our survey methodology combined extensive and intensive pedestrian surveys, geoarchaeological research, geophysics, and use of optically stimulated luminescence analysis for the agricultural terraces, and also remote sensing. The research area covered Urla-Çeşme Peninsula, where 4 of the Ionian polis were situated, which are Erythrai, Klazomenai, Teos, and Lebedos. And this gave us a unique opportunity to conduct a comparative study for understanding similarities and the diversities of Ionian polis, as well as the regional dynamics. The size of the research area reaches up to 1,500 square kilometers, which is very large. And so far, we only covered 20% of it with extensive surveys, and only covered 500 hectares with the intensive surveys, which means we may still continue those surveys in this area in the future. So early years of the research was particularly dedicated to the investigation of Klazomenian Hora, and then the limits of the research area was expanded to Çeşme, to the tip of the peninsula. Fieldwork until today recorded 450 new archaeological sites, plus landscape features like terraces, groves, bridges, and paths. And all of those are classified according to date, function, size, and morphologies. And settlement pattern analysis yielded to significant results about the organization of the Chora and the shifts in the settlement patterns. Since the post-classical urban centers and maritime connections have been excessively emphasized, survey results created a new agenda about the rural landscapes, which have rarely been the subject of Ionian archaeology. The entanglement of Ionians with land and the preclassical landscape are essential for defining Ionia. Therefore, we shifted our view from the sea to the land for our survey to discuss the evidence from the terrestrial land around the polis. Spatial analysis executed in GIS environments showed that the frontiers of the polis territories were mostly determined by the topography, but also demarcated with tumuli, rural shrines, border marks, and forts and watch posts, which imply a conscious organization of the hinterlands during the Archaic period. Here you see several of the horoi inscriptions, the border marks, which mark the borders and the rural, which mark the borders or the frontiers of the polis settlements. And the others are the rural shrines at natural places like caves or rock outcrops placed at the fringes of the territories. And most of those shrines dated back to the prehistoric period, but there is an explicitly intensive use of these places at the dawn of the Archaic period on the basis of the pottery found at those places. Forts and watch posts are also distributed around the Chora, and they are situated at the strategic locations as expected. And the visibility analysis showed that there was a well-planned defensive network enclosing rural lands around the polis centers in the early Archaic period. But also, most of those forts have been previously used during the Bronze Ages. So there was a sort of continuity in this sense. Tumuli are also very important landscape features used to claim the land around the polis, and they presumably have belonged to the elite and used for marking the frontiers. The use of tumuli in Ionia lasts from the early 7th century BC into the Roman period, and some of those have been used several times in the later periods, and unfortunately most have been plundered by illicit digs. And due to this, it is very difficult to date them. But still, I mean, on the basis of the finds, the earliest finds, we may sometimes date those tumuli. And so far, on the peninsula, so far in the peninsula, we recorded more than 140 tumuli. And the spatial analysis, again executed in the GIS environment, clearly showed that the locations of those tumuli were chosen consciously for addressing an audience. 65% of those were placed on the coast, which would be visible for the ones approaching the town from the sea. And the rest of the tumuli were all placed on the roads at visible spots and built by heaps of light-colored stones to catch the viewer's eye immediately. Land use and agricultural potential is another main subject of the survey project. Therefore, agricultural terraces are being recorded and mapped by the field surveys. And we are making use of locations of old olive tree groves and terraces for designing our sampling strategy to discover short-lived small farmsteads and hamlets with low visibility. And for challenging the common idea, which dates terraces earliest to the last century, we initiated a project for dating the terraces by optically stimulated luminescence analysis in the labs. And the preliminary results show that some of the terraces in the Klazomenian Chora already dated to the late Roman and Byzantine era. And the results will be published soon by 3 articles. One of them is in PLOS ONE, the other one is in Antiquity, and another one in the World Archaeology soon in 2021. As a part of the project, we are also practicing historical landscape characterization analysis for providing a basis for the well-planned conservation master plan of the peninsula, where the rate of the destruction caused by the government-sponsored projects is increasing every day. And about the results of the survey, perhaps one of the most stunning outcomes of the fieldwork was the discovery of 15 new late Neolithic sites, which were distributed in the peninsula almost regularly. And this is implying a sort of network which was formed as early as the late Neolithic period. So occurrence of such early economic or cultural network in the region shows us that Ionia was never a desolate place before the first millennium BC. And together with the excavation of large prehistoric sites such as Limantepe, Yeşilova, Ulucak, Çukuruçi, Bağlar Arası, we see that the survey results also show that there was an intricate settlement network in the Western Anatolia since the prehistoric times. Hidden prehistoric landscapes have been one of the major subjects of Aegean archaeology on the basis of finds from early survey projects in mainland Greece. Low quantity of identified prehistoric sites was not simply caused by the methodology. Long-term habitation, texture, and amount of the prehistoric material used as daily wear were important variables for the visibility of prehistoric pottery scatters amongst the later material. And also mound formation is either not likely due to the wandering settlements or alluvial deposition or coastal erosion in the Aegean Anatolia, which makes it difficult to identify the prehistoric sites. In our case, in the peninsula, the size of the identified late Neolithic sites range from 2 hectares to 10 hectares, which means they were large sites. And almost all of them have been inhabited continuously into the classical periods. So that increased the surface visibility, and that's how we could, identify them. And these results imply an even higher potential for the small, short-term prehistoric sites. Late Bronze Age, early Iron Age transition is also part of that hidden landscape phenomenon in the peninsula. Field surveys only recorded a handful number of sites dated to the early Iron Age prior to the late Geometric. This is not an unexpected situation, since the surveys on the Greek mainland have often found it difficult to identify that period also. For example, Messenia expedition, Pylos survey, Laconia survey, Boeotia survey identified not more than several sites dating to the proto-geometric or geometric periods. And in Ionia itself, the surveys around Miletos also have turned up only 2 sites, the sanctuary of Athenia Sessia and Kömür Adası, with evidence for the early Iron Age habitation in the form of a handful of proto-geometric sherds, but nothing else. So in this sense, CLASP, Klazomenai Survey Project, is not an exception to this overall pattern. So far, the surveys have identified 18 sites dating to the late Bronze Age, 21 to the late Geometric, and 78 to the Archaic period, but only 6 sites can be attributed to proto-geometric or geometric. So the low number of sites from those periods around Klazomenai is puzzling, especially if we compare it to developments that took place at the settlement center of Klazomenai from the beginning of the early Iron Age onwards. And here I will give the word to Rick to explain the situation in the settlement center.
Thank you, Elif. Excavations at Klazomenai have been ongoing since the early 1980s. And over the years, Iron Age remains have been encountered at 4 locations throughout the site, which you can see here on the slide. It's actually the excavation in the south sector of the Limantepe Mound, which is here marked as CAT, that are particularly revealing. In this presentation, we only briefly summarize the main developments. More extensive treatment of the early Iron Age phasing will appear in forthcoming publications. The earliest remains excavated in the south sector belong to a large multi-roomed complex with a roughly east-west orientation, a pavement and a deposit of the bones of at least 3 bovines, all of which can be dated to the late 14th century BC based on the associated ceramics. Unfortunately, most of the northern parts of the complex are missing due to substantial intrusions in later periods, but it has become clear that the structure forms one of the largest late Bronze Age buildings excavated at the site to date. After the complex went out of use, the area was abandoned for almost 2 centuries. No evidence for any activity dating to the 13th and much of the 12th century BC has so far been identified. And it appears that during this period, habitation was confined to the fortified north sector of the Limantepe Mound. It's only at the very end of the 12th century that habitation returns to the south sector. Initially, we are dealing with small one-room structures, for example, building 3 and 4 on the slide. But within a generation or two, in the first half of the 11th century, the area was leveled and terraced, and at least 2 large curvilinear structures were constructed. These houses were in use during 2 main phases until the final part of the 10th century. It's also during this period between the middle of the 11th and the end of the 10th century that the settlement expands well beyond the limits of the late Bronze Age settlement, and now comes to encompass both the north and south sector of the Limantepe Hill, as well as the FGT sector, which is located just to the southwest of our south Limantepe south sector. Furthermore, a large and very well preserved pottery kiln has been excavated in the HBT sector, which is located about 700 meters from the core of the settlement. Where the first and second early Iron Age phases seem to represent a gradual expansion of the settlement, the late 10th century marks a significant shift in the history of the settlement. In the first place, the Limantepe Mound is transformed into a burial ground. To date, no architectural remains can be assigned to the later 10th and most of the 9th century, but more than a dozen child and infant burials, mostly in pots or occasionally in a chist grave, and much loose material have been uncovered scattered among what must have been the ruins of an abandoned and collapsed buildings. Simultaneous with this transformation, a very similar burial ground was established in the area around the early Iron Age kiln in the HBT sector, again some 700 meters to the west. Currently, about 44 burials, again mostly belonging to children and infants, have been excavated. The settlement itself appears to have shifted to the MCT sector, located in a geographically rather low area in between the burial grounds on the Limantepe Mound and the HBT sector. Here, previous excavations have revealed 2 strata with ceramics, as well as some limited architectural remains dating between the end of the 10th and the middle of the 8th century. The transformation of the settlement structure at the end of the 10th century is particularly intriguing as its outline with a center surrounded by burial grounds reminds us of what will ultimately come to characterize a full-fledged polis system at the site in the 7th century BC. Before we are there, however, it should be noted that while the MGT sector continues to form a living area, recent excavations have shown that habitation returns to the south sector of the Limantepe Mound at the end of the 9th century or beginning of the 8th century BC. This not only signals once again an expansion of the settlement, but also suggests that the established settlement structure was not yet set in stone. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to follow the developments at the site during the second half of the 8th century. The late geometric period at Klazomenai has been and still is rather elusive. Stratified deposits are extremely rare, and this has not changed with the new excavations. The main reason for this probably is that during the 7th century, Klazomenai witnesses a significant program of building activities, including the establishment of new cemeteries, a renewed intensification of habitation in several quarters, the construction of a defensive wall, and the emergence of a well-organized urban layout on which habitation quarters, industrial areas, and burial grounds are clearly separated. It's therefore quite possible that the leveling activities associated with the archaic building programs had a destructive impact on the late geometric remains. The expansion at the beginning of the early Iron Age has probably much to do with the shifting position of Klazomenai within wider networks of trade and communication in the Aegean and Western Anatolia. During the late Bronze Age, which you can see here, most traffic seems to have had a mainly east-west direction, that is, between the Western Anatolia river valleys and the Aegean. Specifically within the Gulf of Izmir, the site of Panastepe, which at that time was quite likely located on an offshore island, was well positioned to control and profit from this traffic. However, towards the end of the Late Bronze Age, established long-distance networks increasingly fragmented and traffic became much more opportunistic and much less easy to control. In addition, it appears that traffic intensified along the maritime networks in the northern Aegean. Crucially, when looking more closely at the Gulf of Izmir, these essentially north-south movements would have largely bypassed Panastepe in favor of Klazomenai, which formed a natural protected target port where sailors could load and offload goods as well as await favorable weather conditions to return up north. All these developments not just stimulated the demise of Panastepe as a leading power within the Gulf of Izmir, but also provided Klazomenai and its community with new opportunities. Although there is no evidence that Klazomenai took over the position of Panastepe as the leading settlement in the region, it definitely profited from the changes taking place as a turn from the Late Bronze to the Early Iron Age. So, with the developments at Klazomenai in mind, let us return to the rural hinterland of the site. Settlements do not tend to be located randomly throughout the landscape, but are usually positioned at locations that allow them to be connected to other settlements. The first thing we ever did was to try and model the most likely route systems in the study area. For this, we combined archaeological, epigraphical, and historical data with a cost path analysis in a GIS environment. The underlying assumption for this analysis is that particularly in a mountainous and difficult to travel environment, people will try to minimize the amount of effort it takes them to move from point A to point B. By subsequently plotting the Late Bronze Age, Early Iron Age, Late Geometric and Archaic sites onto this model, it has become clear in the first place that most sites are located along overland routes towards Teos, Erythrai, Chesme, and Izmir. But perhaps even more important is that the same routes apparently continue to be used from the Late Bronze Age through to the Archaic period. The fact that the same routes tend to be used throughout history is perhaps not too surprising, given that in mountainous and topographically challenging landscapes, like the Orla Chesme Peninsula, there are often very few alternatives to move between places. The crucial point for our purposes, however, that a continuity in route systems implies that the Early Iron Age landscape must have been far from devoid of travelers. And if this is the case, it's also highly unlikely that the countryside wasn't inhabited as well. So where are the Early Iron Age sites? To some extent, the situation can be ascribed to methodological issues and problems with visibility. First, while intensive surveys were conducted at some sites in the first years of the project, the Turkish authorities restricted the collection of surface material during the archaeological surveys in 2013. And this severely restricted the effectiveness of intensive surveys. As a result, the survey methodology had to be adapted and was no longer suitable for identifying small sites like dispersed farmsteads or hamlets. Second, modern construction associated with the rapidly growing town of Urla, heavy land cover and surface processes like erosion will undoubtedly have had a significant impact on the visibility of archaeological sites. Third, we may also consider the issue of the conservation of Early Iron Age ceramics. While Late Bronze Age finewares from Klazomenai usually feature a slip or are polished and or burnished, and thus have a hard and smooth surface, Early Iron Age wares, although well fired, are usually smoothed only. As a result, the Iron Age ceramics tend to be more prone to wear and tear. And this makes them extremely difficult to identify, particularly when they are found among later material. It should be noted, however, that Late Bronze Age finewares are equally rare within the survey material, and this raises the question to what extent finewares were even distributed or used outside the main settlement at Klazomenai. Indeed, Guy Sanders has recently argued the extent to which poor people in the past had access to pottery has probably been overestimated significantly. Particularly in rural areas, people would have primarily used wooden utensils and only occasionally pottery. In general, painted pottery and perhaps even simple pottery was simply too expensive for them. Consequently, it may be extremely difficult to identify their homes based on pottery scatters. Nonetheless, these methodological and post-depositional processes cannot account fully for the lack of evidence for Iron Age sites. So let us have a closer look at the developments taking place from the Late Bronze Age onwards. So far, as Elif mentioned, 18 Late Bronze Age sites have been identified by the surveys. When we look more closely at their locations, we can observe that they are all located along the main routes across the Cheshire Peninsula. But perhaps even more important is that the closer these sites are situated about 10 to 15 kilometers from Klazomenai. In terms of efficient rural marketing, such a distance is often considered ideal for those wanting to bring surplus supplies to a market town or dominant center. At the same time, considering the secondary position that Klazomenai occupied within the Gulf of Izmir, this distance would probably have been too great for Klazomenai to exercise any direct economic or political influence over these rural areas. So probably Klazomenai was just one site among the many. The dynamics changed at the beginning of the early Iron Age, when the settlement of Klazomenai established itself as an important target port within northern Aegean trade networks. At first, the small number of larger rural sites identified by the surveys appears to be at odds with this situation. Things become potentially easier to understand, however, when we consider that the changing situation at Klazomenai inevitably led to an increased demand for particular commodities in order to supply the inhabitants and visitors of Klazomenai with, for instance, foodstuffs, livestock, and commodities that could be exchanged. This, in turn, arguably stimulated a more regular and potentially more organized movement of people and goods along established overland route networks. When looking from this perspective, it becomes then tempting to interpret the decrease in identified sites not so much as a reflection of the abandonment of the countryside, but rather as a manifestation of an attempt by people to capitalize on the new opportunities by nucleating a location that were either strategic points within overland networks or had direct access to natural resource and agricultural areas that could provide the commodities that were in demand at Klazomenai. Against this background, it's interesting to note a particular class of handmade and burnished pottery from Archaic, one of the survey sites. This pottery type shows close connections to handmade pottery, which we also found in Klazomenai, where it forms a very heterogeneous group in terms of fabric and shape, and consists almost exclusively of containers that were most suitable for transport and or storage, and in some cases perhaps cooking. The fact that similar pottery is found both in the countryside and at Klazomenai makes it tempting to argue that perhaps a significant amount of handmade pottery found at Klazomenai was not produced there, but rather was produced at the rural sites and used for the transport of goods to the market at Klazomenai. In any case, in our scenario, it's important to emphasize that the rural sites would have been dependent on the success of Klazomenai in operating as a mediator between the maritime and overland route networks, while at the same time Klazomenai would have been equally dependent on the rural settlements for the supply of food stocks and surplus, as well as the marketing of imported low-level commodities. When considered from this perspective, there's good reason to believe that the early Iron Age landscape around Klazomenai essentially operated as an interaction sphere or small world in which cohesion resulted from and was constituted by habitual face-to-face interaction based on proximity and various kinds of social and economic ties rather than political dominance. As we will see, however, this situation changes drastically at the very end of the early Iron Age with the formation of the polis. And with this, I would like to return the microphone to Elif.
So the formalization of polis is based upon the organization of the countryside and the settlement center, or the Astu and the Chora, which makes the polis. So for Klazomenai, both survey and the excavation data strongly suggest that the settlement core and the territory have been organized simultaneously in the beginning of the 7th century. Field surveys provided data not only for Klazomenai, but also for Teos. And at both sites, we may follow the organization of necropolis surrounding the habitation area at the dawn of the Archaic period. And this pattern, which sees the organization of necropolis around the settlement centers in Archaic period, is determined both at Klazomenai and Teos. Archaic settlement of Teos is only identified with intensive surveys on the basis of pottery scatters. However, for Klazomenai, we have more detailed and further evidence for the organization of the Astu in the 7th century BC. As Rick already explained, there was a preliminary phase at Klazomenai before it becomes a full-fledged polis system in the 7th century. Previously occupied Liman Tepe, LMT, transformed into a burial ground, and the core of the settlement shifted southwestward, and to the west of the new core settlement, another burial ground was established. The organization in the end of the 10th century suggests some sort of formalization of the settlement boundaries that might point to the emergence of what we may call perhaps protopolis. So this initial proto-urban organization cannot be followed at the territory. And this indicates that Klazomenai did not exercise any significant level of political control over that few number of rural settlements. However, as a rule of codependency, these settlements might have operated as mediators between the maritime and overland route networks and played a significant role in the development of a commercial mesh around the large centers. The nature of the interaction between Klazomenai and these rural sites may be explained as an economic or social one rather than a political dominance. From the late 8th century and early 7th century onwards, the small world around Klazomenai developed and quickly expanded. The number of identified sites from the Archaic period reached up to 78. And within a matter of a few generations, habitation expanded beyond the established route networks. And this transformation from a nucleated to dispersed settlement pattern implies population growth, naturally, and the diffuse use of the arable land for cultivation. In addition to the feeding, the expanding population, cultivating fields for trade commodities must have created a significant agricultural surplus for the trade also. Following the routes, we see that new sites tended to be established along the main overland routes, which seems to be in use, latest from late Bronze Age. And along the route to Teos, a string of late geometric and archaic sites implies the intensification of traffic between those two, as well as their growing importance as a point of connection between the maritime and overland networks. Although we currently lack firm evidence from neighboring sites like Teos, Eritrea, and Smyrna, it seems highly likely that they were also involved into similar developments, which yielded to a regional system in the peninsula. And it is hardly a surprise that border disputes occurred frequently in Ionia during the Iron Age, and especially during the Archaic period. Around Klazomenai, this situation is, in the first place, exemplified by the emergence of a defensive network comprising border forts and watch posts, and also fortified settlements. In addition, as I already mentioned, tumuli were placed along the main routes and clearly visible places for claiming the land. And rural shrines at natural places like caves, capes, rock, and outcrop rocks have been used intensely for defining the frontiers, which was a fundamental issue for the formation of polis as an institution. Simultaneously, at the settlement center during the 7th century BC, there was a urban planning activity which includes construction of a defensive wall and a well-organized urban layout in which domestic quarters, industrial areas, and burial grounds were clearly separated. These activities not only represent the formal establishment of an ASTU, but also point to the emergence of Klazomenai as one of the main regional civic and political centers. Both in the ASTU and the Chora, there was an ultimate transformation from a loosely defined small world based on flexible social and economic ties into a fully fledged polis system characterized by a clear hierarchy and firmly defined borders. In conclusion, we argue that throughout the early Iron Age, developments in the hinterland of Klazomenai were rooted in a particular local configuration that was at the same time completely tangled up in supralocal Aegean networks of interaction. And we maintain, for instance, that the low number of early Iron Age sites recorded by the field surveys does not necessarily imply that the rural area around Klazomenai was essentially desolate. In fact, although methodological issues and post-depositional process may have influenced the visibility of sites, we believe that the reduction in identified sites actually reflects a meaningful historical process. We postulate that the transformation of Klazomenai into a key target port within Northern Aegean trade and communication networks at the beginning of early Iron Age would not only have stimulated increased overland traffic, but also a greater demand for the commodities and food stocks at the main center. This is in turn set into a motion process in which people try to capitalize on the opportunities provided by the changing position of Klazomenai by nucleating at locations that were either strategic points within established overland networks or had direct access to natural resources and agricultural areas that could provide the commodities that were in demand at Klazomenai. Against this background, we postulate that interaction between Klazomenai and the rural settlements was largely based on codependency rather than political dominance. As such, we envisioned the early Iron Age landscape around Klazomenai essentially as a loosely defined small world that through Klazomenai tied in with the wider Aegean world. In the course of the 8th and the early 7th centuries, this small world expanded rapidly, and this transformation would not only have undermined the very foundations of the early Iron Age small world, but quite likely also resulted in growing tensions, as I mentioned before. And we have proposed that the formation of a full-fledged polis system at Klazomenai, characterized by a clear hierarchy and the defined borders, and the organization of the Chora and the urban area simultaneously. If there is, as we believe, merit to this suggestion, then the formation of the polis would first and foremost have been a product of particular local circumstances. This in turn leads to the inevitable conclusion that the emergence of civic polities in Ionia cannot be regarded as a mere extension of the Greek polis, if such a thing even existed, but needs to be understood in the first place within local and regional contexts. I think we finished. Thank you for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much. We have had both detailed survey data, detailed excavation data, and some bigger picture questions, some very significant big picture questions. I see we already have some questions in the question and answer box, so I'm going to ask those first before I start with my questions. Alan Greaves, hello, says, with regard to polis state formation, which came first, the territory or the city?
Good question.
I can't see my screen. Wait a minute. Oh my God.
You could stop
May
sharing.
I stop sharing?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
So which came first in polis formation, the territory or the city?
With regard to the polis state formation, which came first, the territory or the city? Oh, this is a tricky question, Alan. Thank you. Not very friendly, huh? Well, I would say perhaps it was in the city. What do you think, Rick? We never discussed it, actually.
No,
Because
but I think they're mostly going hand in hand, actually. I don't think there's just one real start, but they're just pulling each other ahead into essentially the polis in the end. But we see already some things developing in the late geometric, and then it develops through in the Archaic period. So it's not directly, yeah, it's probably going hand in hand at the same time. It's probably a pretty complex development, which it's very difficult to get to decide which is going first, if there is anyone going first in this case.
Well, the evidence from the settlement is more abundant. Perhaps this is much easier to define it. From the Chora, we don't have much material. It only depends on the idea depends on the continuity, and also the material, the pottery, which we can date in accordance with the settlement center. But yes, I believe, I agree with Rick that it should be hand in hand.
I think that must be right. The ASTI can only develop as long as there is a Chora which can support it. And I think one interesting thing that you have brought out is that part of that conceptual Chora is not just the land-based territories, it's also the sea routes, and that it's the strengthening of those as well as the strengthening of the land routes to see a Chora which is not just land, but also maritime as well, would be interesting. Anyway, Olivier asks, what about Erai? Any clue of its early history? Why not Erai instead of Teos as the natural endpoint of the north-south road?
Yeah, very good question. Because Erai was also a polis as early as the Archaic period, but during the field surveys, we could not find any early material in that area. I mean, few sherds, but nothing more than that. So that's why we did not use this. We did not use it in our analysis, since we are emphasizing the continuity. But you are right, Erai should be one of the important sites in this picture also.
I think maybe it comes into your picture of tensions, why some places work out and some places don't. Sue Sherritt asks, Rick, it's interesting that you're suggesting that the handmade transport and storage pots were possibly produced at rural sites. Is there any evidence that this is a pattern that also occurs in the Bronze Age?
I don't know the Bronze Age pottery well enough for that, the handmade material, but yeah, handmade pottery is also used in middle and late Bronze Age, so it's already in use for quite a while. So it's not a new occurrence in the Iron Age. It's something that goes back in time. I don't have enough Bronze Age material at my disposal to have a good analysis of that stuff, because most of the Bronze Age is excavated by the Ankara team. So we only have very limited Bronze Age material. Only essentially was associated with the late Bronze Age building we excavated. But yeah, it's quite possibly that it goes back in time. That's very well possible.
Is there any chance of doing some kind of thin sectioning, or to look at the soils and the clays that are used and try and do some provenancing that way?
Might be possible. The problem is that there is such a huge amount of fabrics among the handmade pottery that it's extremely difficult to get any grouping done, even. So that also might suggest that it's not coming from a single center like Klazomenai, but actually coming from a wider area around, and that people just use the clay beds that were available at them at that time, and that might even shift through time constantly. So yeah, we are still thinking about doing some thin section. We actually had one NAA done on a later piece from, I think, late geometric, and that came from the same group as the Klazomenai sarcophagi from the Archaic period. What it exactly means, not sure yet, but yeah, that's something that to think about as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. Sue has also just said what you said about the apparent variety of fabrics makes sense. I think that does seem to support your view. And I guess the thing would be, it's very tempting to go for nice fine wares to look at first to see if they're imported, but encouraging people to look at all the coarsewares can be harder to get people interested in coarsewares.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, fortunately, we have some very complete pots, so that's very useful because they're coming from the cemeteries actually. A lot of them. They're reused as burial containers for children and infants. Quite a lot.
That's interesting because then that raises questions of reuse and how long they're in circulation. That's interesting. David Hill asks, do you have any indication of which border was the most conflictual for Klazomenai? Was it Teos, Smyrna, Erythrai?
Well, actually, we have epigraphic evidence for that, and we have 2 cases with Teos, so it should be Teos. And there are more, I mean, we identified more sites in that border also, more smaller sites. Yeah. But I mean, it's just the epigraphic evidence needs to be tested.
And I think linked to that, there is an anonymous question which has come in about natural resources and has this had an impact on the relationships between Klazomenai and neighboring cities? Is that part of?
Yeah, there should be, but I mean, it's not easy to explain that with field survey methodologies.
True. Another question from Spiros Triantos. Can we trace the territory borders of the early city-state to the tumuli surrounding the site? And Olivier Mariot has got something on a similar theme. He talks about the tumuli in the Chora. Are they individual graves, as in the published ones near Klazomenai, or collective burials, as in Caria? In Colophon, all the hill tumuli are classical or Hellenistic. So there's 2 questions on the tumuli there.
Yeah, okay, Spiros, we see the emergence of tumuli in the 7th century BC, in the early 7th century BC. So that was the early phase of the state. I'm not in the 10th century or before, but in the 7th century, when there was an urban form at the settlement center, you see the emergence of the tumuli at the fringes of the territory. So if you can call it the early state, yes, I mean. And Olivier, actually, this is also a difficult question because those tumuli, I mean, for 140 tumuli are recorded by field surveys. We are not excavating them. Most of them have been already plundered. But from the ones that are located closer to the urban settlement and which have been excavated by the museum, we know that they were individual graves.
Okay, interesting.
And of course, we have tumuli from the classical and Hellenistic as well.
Fantastic. Chidem Mano. Hi, Chidem says, what about connections such as shared pottery types, etc., during the late Bronze and early Iron Age with a central Anatolia, for example, Hittite and Neo-Hittite civilizations? Your presentation suggests that your region didn't have any connections with central Anatolia, but only the Aegean and mainland Greece.
Well, the late Bronze Age ceramics are very much linked to Western Anatolia, so ceramic groups in Western Anatolia, like grey wares, red buff wares, and everything that also found in any basically all other sites. At the beginning of the Iron Age, we see a gradual shift towards more Aegean type, especially ceramics, with the introduction of protogeometric pottery, which shows a special connection with the Northern Aegean, like not just Euboea, but also the Macedonian coastal Macedonia, in the Northern Aegean. So we don't have, I don't think there are even for the late Bronze Age clear connection with Central Anatolia. I think if there were, you might find them at Panastepe, which seems to have controlled the networks that come down from the river valleys and into the Aegean and vice versa. And Klazomenai only occupied a very secondary position at that time. And for the Iron Age, it actually is the same more or less, and Klazomenai is more tangled up into the Northern Aegean networks rather than the Western Anatolian ones, as far as we can see.
Okay, I suppose linked to that is a question from Megan Magnum, who asked, is it clear what caused the shift in primary direction of the trade routes from east-west to north-south? Would it be increased trade with the North Aegean settlements or a shift in the commodities?
I think especially that there's an increased traffic in the Northern Aegean, and probably that's partly to do with some of the metal resources that we have in coastal Macedonia. It's also in this area which sites are flourishing at this time. So like around Torone and sites like in that area. So it seems to be that there is, yeah, it's more like that. So that it's more the, on the one hand, there's a fragmentation of long distance route networks, both in the river valleys as well as in the Eastern Mediterranean generally. And instead of that, we get more regional connections, which are more opportunistic, less easier to control. And it seems that then at that time, the North Aegean networks start to intensify, probably as a result of some kind of metal trade, which is going on, which initially came probably from the river valleys as well, from inland Anatolia to the coast. So it's a whole shift in trade and yeah, and maritime networks actually that changes a lot of things.
And then Maria Nenakova asks, are there any traces of Minoan presence on the site?
Not a clue. That's too early actually for us. I think there is some Minoan type pottery, but yeah, that's not in our excavations. That's the.
We only have one site in the territory of Theos, actually, with Minoan pottery, but there is only one.
That was interesting. That does imply changes, constant changes almost in the connections, the maritime connections, which directions they're going in and which periods. That is interesting. I've got oh gosh, I think something else is coming. Olivier's coming on. Olivier's got a question, but I had one which I'm going to ask immediately after. Olivier, maybe it's not the question of the rise of the north-south road, which had always been there, but rather the collapse of the east-west one. Interesting.
Yeah, it probably is to some extent. Those North Aegean networks were already there, but it just intensified at the beginning of the Iron Age, quite possibly connected with the collapse of the east-west networks and the ability of, for instance, Panastepa to control such networks. That changes a lot in the Gulf of Izmir. The political dynamics in the Gulf of Izmir changed significantly at the end of the Bronze Age, probably as a result of that collapse of the original east-west networks.
That is interesting. We've got another question come in, but I'm going to try and slip my question in first, if I may. And this is a lot of this hangs on an increase in sites, but also an increase in population around this time. There's an idea of an expansion of people across the landscape, but also an expansion of people living within the city itself. But what does it look like in terms of settlement densities? I mean, is there any difference in settlement density? Because could this be part of the change as well?
You mean
yeah.
I'm sorry, go on.
Well, if you look at the site, actually, we see that the late Bronze Age, everything was forced into a relatively small area on top of the Limantepe Mound, including industrial areas. There are 5 or 6 pottery kilns in that area, houses, everything. And when we look at the early Iron Age, it starts to slowly expand. And now we also have, for instance, a pottery kiln, which is 700 meters away. So it's probably the density becomes less. It's more spread out at the beginning of the Iron Age. And it's possible that some people might come in from the rural sides or maybe from Panastepe. We don't have any evidence for any break or whatever, or any influx of people, or major influx of people. But yeah, it seems to be that the density of habitation becomes much less than in the late Bronze Age, which is interesting, because it actually seems that the Iron Age is much more safe than the late Bronze Age period. If you look at the late Bronze Age site being fortified and all habitation being confined within a relatively small area on top of a fortified mound.
And this speaks to your idea of mutual collaboration across the landscape rather than control, then top-down control, if you've got more of a sense. Sorry, I'd like to talk about that more, but John Brendan Knight has asked, regarding potential conflict with Teos, one of the very few Klazomenaian overseas settlements at Abdera in Thrace was refounded or taken over by Teians in the mid-6th century, which may suggest conflict between the two. My question is, why do you think Klazomenai did not seem to participate in overseas settlements as many other Ionian communities in the Archaic period did, notwithstanding the presence of Klazomenian pottery at many sites in the Black Sea?
Rick, do you have an answer for that?
No. That's a very difficult one, because you get into the stimulus for how do you call it, colonies, founding colonies, which is a very complicated issue. No, I don't really have a direct answer to that. Maybe because Klazomenai didn't need to expand into other territories.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we should discuss what were the dynamics of the colonization, because when you make a calculation about the land potential and the agricultural potential of Klazomenai, you can see that it could always feed a lot of people, many more than the people who have lived in that area. So obviously they did not need to move overseas for food, but maybe also in means of trade. It was an agricultural community. We may assume that it was their economy was mainly, I think, based upon the agriculture. So this may be a reason, but still, I mean, it is very difficult to give a clear answer to this.
I wonder whether perhaps part of the answer may lie in your idea of not so much tension between the city and the Chora, that there's a more collaborative relationship. I mean, one of the reasons that people might leave home is stasis, political disenfranchisement, and that this is linked to that kind of internal political difficulty, and infighting and factionalism is linked to lots of stories of colonization, at least. And I think there are fewer stories about stasis within Klazomenai that I'm aware of. So maybe there's less dissatisfaction at home, less political wrangling, less people feeling disenfranchised. Maybe, just a thought. Just a thought. Paul Steinfeld has said in the chat rather than the Q&A that he would love to hear more, and sends us email. And Charlotte has reminded us to have a look at the BIA's website for upcoming seminars, both in this series and other series, and also to sign up for our email list. You can get all the latest gossip and information from us. We have quickly more questions. Wow, even now we're running out of time. Maria Nenakova asks again, if I understood right, the Pithos burials were near or even inside the city walls. Is that right?
True.
Yeah, well, depending on which city wall, they are inside the Bronze Age city wall, but the Pithos burials are, well, in the Iron Age, there was no city wall around it. So I don't know which city wall you mean, the late Bronze Age one, the Archaic one.
I think she means the Archaic one, the one which was built in the 7th century.
Yeah, then they are, I think, mostly inside the Archaic city wall, enclosed by the Archaic city wall. But yeah, the Pithos burials are all from the 10th, 9th century. So they're earlier than the, I think some of them were actually even partly underneath the city wall, at least very close to it. So they actually built on an area that was previously used or a couple centuries before used as a burial ground.
Mm-hmm.
But we're not talking about Pithos burials being explicitly made within a pre-existing city wall, the city wall post.
No.
Okay.
Not necessarily. It is that we have an early Bronze Age city wall in that area, which was probably still visible.
Mm.
And it may to some extent have demarcated some kind of boundary for the settlement of Klazomenai, but it's not that. It's not like a city wall like we have in the Archaic period. It's more ephemeral than that. So it seems to be that they more dedicated certain areas for burial grounds like they did in the Archaic period as well, rather than that we have actually a direct relation to a city wall or something like that.
David Hill asks, what evidence is there for a growth in communal cults binding the settlements together and forming a common identity, certainly in respect to the formalization of borders and territory?
Well, we just see the reuse of those cult places, because most of those places, the caves and those outcrop rocks and, landmarks, which have been used previously during the prehistoric periods, was again in use during the early Archaic period, which shows an intensity. So obviously they have been used as communal places between the different polis societies, perhaps, or just to bring together the rural societies who were living close by for a social organization.
We have a few more comments coming in on the question of Klazomenian colonization or lack thereof. Sue Sherritt asks, perhaps one of the reasons for interest in Abdera was perhaps Thracian silver?
Sure, quite possibly.
Why not?
Why not? Silver's always good. And Olivier says, again, linking back to this, regardless of the significant improvement in our knowledge of the site, Klazomenai must be a second-hand, I think he means to say with this, the signs settlement in comparison to Miletus, Polis in Ionia are small.
Are they really that small? I think that most of them are actually bigger than most on the Greek mainland.
That's true, yeah, much larger. I mean, if we are talking about the physical size and the population, so in means of complexity, social complexity, okay, but if we are talking about the size, yes, the Ionian polis were much larger than the ones on the mainland Greece.
David Hill agrees with you. He said much larger, exclamation mark.
And what do you mean by the second-hand polis? I don't get that.
No, Olivia, you can let us know. I wonder if he means it's not as grand or as large or as powerful.
Yeah, Miletus was always a major power in the region, but provocative. Thank you. That's not provocative.
I think that perhaps we are now coming to 20 minutes past 6 and we should perhaps end with this fantastic provocation. It has been an exciting seminar. There's been lots of different things touched on, and it's been interesting to see, especially the sheer range of different technological approaches that you are bringing to getting stuff out of the survey landscape, which, you know, we weren't able to do 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So we're able to do so much more now, and there's so much more to discuss, which we could do forever. But we're getting some thank yous in from everybody. Thank you all, participants and attendees, for joining us and for asking your questions. And even bigger thanks to both Rick and Elif for sharing their time and their effort and their good humour with us. We hope to see you all next month. We'll be dialing back in time to the Middle Bronze Age for the next of our virtual seminars. And I hope to see as many of you there as can make it. Good night, everyone. İyi akşamlar.
Thank you. Thank you. İyi akşamlar.